let's get started on some ground rules. It's so easy. If you have not participated in an open mic before, this is a forum for discussion. Although you're muted, all you have to do is ask to want to talk. We're happy to turn that back on. But a lot of people will be doing other things or have some background noise. Please let us know if you want to participate and talk. All you have to do is hit the chat box and ask, and Gavin or I can turn that on. Roya and Chase, I turned yours on. We will send you this recording when we're done. We're happy to do that. We'll also have some content for you. We always do. We always try to share something that you can take away and reflect on or share with other people on your team. We call this an open mic because you're welcome to stop me at any time, ask me any questions, or ask anybody on the team any questions. We try to put in enough time to prepare these events that it's worthwhile for those people who are taking a half hour or 40 minutes out of their day, to sit with us and talk about these topics. We really do get excited about these topics. Not only do we write the blog and then follow up with this open mic process, but we also use this as a thinking time, so we can reflect on things and shoot ideas back and forth. And so let's get started. If anyone has any questions at any time, please remember, this is not a very formal environment. We really encourage you to stop and ask questions. All right, so today we're here to talk about the enhancement of standardization of climate-related disclosures for investors. We're going to dig into the topic enough that I won't spend too much time here, but my name is Ted Atwood. I've been doing this for 28 years. I'm one of many refrigerant geeks here at trackref. And really, this is what we do. We love the topics. We love to talk about them. We really try to curate this information in a way that will be able to deliver value to everybody. So we really appreciate and value your time. So here's what today is about. On March 22nd, the SEC hosted an event, March 21st, the SEC hosted an event. Apologize for that March 22nd thing. And they released a new set of proposed rules that would require domestic or foreign companies, registrants, to include climate-related information in their registration statements and periodic reports. So boom, it was a big day. I don't know if anyone had time to participate in that event, but it was absolutely worthwhile. One of the most interesting meetings I've been to. Now, hold on a second, sorry. Moving around a few things to get them out of my way. This quote is from Allison Heron-Lee. She was the acting chair at the time of the SEC when they began the evaluation process to determine whether or not ESG filings were a reasonable thing for the SEC to manage. At the time, the outgoing chairman was a guy named Elard Rossman, and he said, look, the SEC's rule writing process is slow by design. When we enshrine a new disclosure in our rules, we want to feel confident that they'll be appropriate and relevant for a lot of years, since the commission normally does not revisit them for a long period of time. And at the time, he wrote that it wasn't clear to him that they had sufficient certainty about what is or crucially required in order to continue to be material information for a new line item on new ESG disclosures. Now, at the time, and it's important to point out that Elad was a Republican. So this issue has been in front of Democratic and Republican SEC commissioners for at least 3 years. As of last week, the commission, which is now made up of Commissioner Gensler, who's the chairman of the commission, as well as Carolyn Crenshaw, Allison Lee, and Hester Pierce, voted 3 yes and 1 no to accept the responsibility to improve the disclosure of ESG information. Now, Elad went on a year ago, and I'm going to read a little something from you because I think it's valuable. He went on to say that the question of ESG information is missing in our markets, and it's first and foremost a question for investors. But it's been instructive to hear companies share perspectives about how they engage with investors on ESG issues. And when the SEC was querying companies about their responsibility for reporting, they all responded that they felt compelled to comply with investor or shareholder requests for information, but that each of the shareholder requests for information was different. And this was creating a tremendous amount of uncertainty about what was expected and what had to be delivered. And so I think it's valuable to know that whether it was a Republican or Democratic administration, this really was not so much a political issue as it was an issue of whether the SEC had a responsibility to shareholders and investors and how they would exercise that responsibility. All right, now we're here to talk about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And this chart represents these pretty well. Scope 1, that's in the middle, that's the green line there, or the center one that's got the upward arrow. Those are emissions that occur from sources that are controlled or owned by an organization. These are related to fugitive emission sources like refrigerants, AC units, refrigeration, fire suppression systems, which are largely based on or have a large base of refrigerants in them. But it can also include things like combustion emissions from fuel sources on site, or even from your fleet, your rolling fleet, related to refrigerant emissions, as well as combustion engine energy consumption, so fuel, diesel, gas, etc. Although we're not really talking too much about scope 2 or scope 3 today, I'm happy to address them. Scope 2 emissions are listed here in blue to the left. And those emissions are indirect greenhouse gas emissions associated with basically the purchase of electricity, or if you're buying steam, or if you buy cooling. So even if you're plugged into a cooling plant, you're expected to report the GHG emissions from the cooling plant. And in the cooling plant situation, your scope 2 emissions are essentially their scope 1 emissions. And the same thing goes for scope 3. This is purchased material. This is your third-party vendors. These are your supply sources. These are assets that you don't own, but they're controlled by organizations that you use in your supply chain to deliver whatever it is you're doing. And these emissions can oftentimes represent a majority of a company's emissions. So you'll hear a lot of talk about scope 3. Happy to address them, but we're really not here to talk about that specifically today. All right, I found this very interesting. I asked a whole bunch of people who was responsible for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions when they started, and most people didn't know the answer. If you do know the answer, good for you. If you don't, this was all started by the World Resource Institute. 1999, they began an accounting, let's say a GHG accounting evaluation, and they've revisited these accounting practices and these GHG protocols. So scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. The last time they revisited them was in 2013, as far as I know. But I found it fascinating that these have been around, actually 2016, my apology. But I found it fascinating that these scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions have been around for just about 20 years. And now they've come into a much more formal structure. And here's exactly what the SEC wrote. Scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which would need to be separately disclosed or disaggregated by each type of greenhouse gas on an aggregated basis. And then disclosures would be required on a gross basis and relative to intensity, which is the GHG, the GWP, But also, the tons of carbon dioxide have to have some type of dollar of revenue tied to it. I found this really interesting. This is actually from the SEC summary page. I'm going to stop here for a second because the next couple of slides are really the specifics. So I want to give anybody a chance to ask questions. All right. No questions, Gavin?
Nope.
All right. So what do you have to report? How climate-related risks have had or are likely to have a material impact on your business and its financial statements, as well as affected or are likely to affect your company's strategy, business model, and outlook.
Ed, I have a quick question. Maybe we'll expand the conversation. So for those that have privately held companies that aren't under SEC obligations, where does this fit within their roadmap? And from a scope 3 point of view for those publicly traded companies?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. So what you'll likely find is that whatever lending institution, banking relationship you have, you are to that banking institution part of scope 3 emissions for them. So you may not be a publicly traded company. There are roughly 3,500 publicly traded companies in the United States. If you are not a publicly traded company and you're thinking, okay, great, I slid by this SEC responsibility, you're very likely, and this is a big one, you're very likely to have to provide your scope 1 and 2 emissions to whoever your lending or banking partner is, because they'll need that as part of their scope or ESG reporting. So your scope 1 emissions become their scope 3. That answer that, Chase?
Yep. Yeah, I think that's good clarification. So if you're selling a widget to any publicly traded company, they need to know the carbon intensity to produce said widget for that public company.
Yep, exactly. All right. The next thing you want to be able to explain, and this is actually stated in the SEC's ruling, which was voted 3-4, 1 against. How did you detect, evaluate, or manage this risk? And is the process to do this integrated into your broader risk management program? So you'll have to be able to answer that question. Are you using an internal carbon price, and how did you create it? This is very important because it's part of the disclosure. Then they want a description of any scenarios or assumptions or projected financial impacts related to this climate risk modeling, in a lot of the same way that you would have to do financial modeling related to risk and materiality. You would also have to do the same thing for your ESG reporting. And the big question is, do you have a climate transition plan? That climate transition plan may be something like net zero, if you have some type of net carbon goal. And then you have to set the targets and the metrics for that, how you're measuring it. Which brings us to the road to net zero. If you decide that you're on the road to net zero, you have to tell the SEC how you're going to get there. You can't just say we're on the road to net zero. You'll have to talk about the scope of activities encompassed, the time horizon, and any interim targets. So if you have a 20, 30, 50% reduction in carbon, they're expecting you to document that, then provide the narrative and the backup to prove that you're on track to reach that or not. That'll have to be one of your KPIs that you report against. They want to know, in addition to how you're going to achieve that goal, but they're going to want to see intermittent progress reports related to that. And if you're using carbon offsets or renewable energy certificates, they want to know how you're using those to accomplish that goal. So if you're going to miss your goal because you might have been using a reduction in energy or a reduction in leak rates, but you can't hit those numbers, they want to know how much carbon are you buying to offset those specific items. So this is pretty powerful, and I haven't really drilled into the hyper-specific stuff, which is towards the end. So does anyone have any questions about this? Chase, Roya, Gavin, anything? All right. Now, in addition to the things that have been mentioned, They want to know how your board of directors or management are going to oversee climate-related risks and your responses to any of the failed efforts or successes along the way. And I found this fantastic report from Ernst & Young where they've been surveying CEOs, and one of the things I found here is the financial planning and analysis process. Basically, a set of 4 processes or activities: the planning, budgeting, financial planning, and management or performance reporting, and then forecasting. And this is the answer that people gave when they were queried about this FP&A process, financial planning and analysis. They said the sheer volume of external data was difficult for them. They did have some cause from COVID-19. You can see what the results are here. This study is really fantastic. It's fascinating. But they were really worried about data quality. Financial people didn't feel like they had the right talents to do this job yet, and that's going to have to change. That's a big, rapid movement in their world. I would say it's existential in a lot of ways. They didn't feel, they felt like skills were adequate, but they just didn't feel like they had the adequate skills in the right place to get the data. But most companies felt like they had enough technology to do this. And additionally, what they found for scope 1 and 2 reporting is that it took between 5 and 10 tools or resources to be able to consolidate and get access to that information. So it's an interesting number. Also, it's important to mention that a year ago, there were roughly 14 frameworks for how to disclose your scope 1, 2 emissions. Today, there are 5. And I think we're going to see that number go down to 3. And I think that's where item number 1 here on this external data, knowing which data to access or where information is coming from and how to make sure that it's the right information. I think that got confusing over the last year, but I think that's about to clear up. So, and you'll notice a little footnote at the bottom around scope 3 emissions, but speaking right to the scope 1 and 2 emissions, really what authority does the SEC have? Well, the Securities Exchange Act in 1934 was created to govern securities transactions on the secondary market. And some key takeaways from the meeting were that there's enough sections in both section SK as well as the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to give the SEC authority to govern these actions. And there'll be a new section called 10K in the disclosures that companies will be expected to fill out. I don't have a sample of what that form looks like, but we know that it will be called Form 10K. And the form's going to be due at the same time as your annual report. There is an indication and a statement that conflicts in the SEC's filing that talked about intermittent or periodic filing. So if you're doing quarterly filings, there is an assumption based on one section that says that you'll provide the SEC with updates quarterly. So the same time that you're filing your financial Securities Exchange documents, you'll also be filing your ESG documents, so your 10K. However, I did find another section that mentioned annually. So I think these are some of the things that will get flushed out as we get closer to the actual launch date for these. And if you're wondering what a launch date is, the SEC said they're going to take their time with the actual launch date, but they did give a horizon date for when reports will be due. We're going to get to that. Another element to this responsibility is an ability to have somebody attest to the records. So your financial statement footnote disclosures are going to have to include audit, the normal audit requirements, and your scope 1 and 2 emissions disclosures will have to have some type of attestation related to the facts that you're providing. So we're moving rapidly away from estimates, and we're moving towards factual numbers. And the SEC actually brought this up in their discussion, and when they were talking about their authority. And the SEC, as I mentioned earlier, stated very clearly that similar to their other authorities under SK, Section SK, that also, as stated here, call for the disclosures about corporate governance. They have this authority under 17 CFR Part 229. As a footnote, I felt like this was a really important section since the SEC is using these other segments, these other rulings, to pivot their authority, to control the behavior of both the boards and management teams. And I found it was interesting that when I read through SEC changes in the past, for instance, the Dodd-Frank changes that went into place in 2011, they only received 70 comments. It wouldn't seem on its own to be abnormal unless you look at the SEC ESG comments that we're talking about today. The SEC has received nearly 5,000 comments on this ruling already. And those were submitted up through the middle of this month. 5,000 is the biggest I found on any ruling at the SEC. So I think the SEC has seen and heard it all. And when they get to the granularity of what is expected of companies and submitters, registrants as they refer to them, it's understandable why 5,000 people commented. And by the way, I should also note, most of the comments were very positive. The numbers in the high, well over 70% of the comments were positive. I did not read all of them. I read a number of evaluations of them. I probably read about 100. And there was only one governor who voted against it. So, and she was aware of the comments as well, as were the people who voted for it. Okay, so here it is. Here's your deadline. Large accelerated filers, which I'll share in a minute with who's a large accelerated filer, they will be expected to report their scope 1 and 2 emissions in 2023 for the 2023 year. Accelerated filers will be expected to do it for 2024, and non-accelerated filers for 2024 as well. And scope 3 emissions will be required a year later. Everyone gets an extra year to get all of their scope 3 emissions together. Now, the final column out over here, let's see, laser pointer. This group, this is the group, this is where the attestation is required. So you're required to provide a report in 2023, but you don't have to have a assurance or attestation completed until the year later, 2024. And so it's a whole year later for these attestation responsibilities. This one's 2 years later. I guess this is 2 years later as well, for reasonable assurance. And what they said is they understand that there'd be some amount of estimating in year 1, but then by year 2, things would be, there'd be a limited attestation responsibility. And then by year 3, this thing would be rock solid, that these numbers would be away from estimating and towards factual disclosure of numbers. Now, I see a couple of service provider companies on this call. So I want to point out the SEC's disclosure has nothing to do with EPA regulations. We're going to talk about that. What this group of people are responsible for reporting are all fugitive emissions. 1 pound, 5 pound, 50 pound, AC, data cooling, you name it, refrigeration, process cooling, that's the expectation. If I don't get questions on that, I'll be shocked. All right, wondering whether you're a accelerated non-filer or accelerated filer, well, here you are. 75 to 700 million, annual revenue of 100 million. I think this speaks for itself. You'll get an idea of who you are. Let's see. Wait. I see a question, Gavin. I'm unable to click it. Can you let me know what that says?
Yeah, it was just someone saying that they liked the presentation and they need to go.
Oh, all right. Well, sorry, you have to go. All right, thank you. All right, so refrigerant disclosure, what does one look like? This is what a refrigerant disclosure looks like. I want you to note stationary and mobile scope 1 emissions in this situation are 771,000 tons. Fugitive emissions from refrigerants are 1.67 million tons. And if you read what this disclosure mentions, it mentions that they're not reporting their HCFC emissions, and which are the R22 emissions. They're only reporting HFC emissions. And so this number would go up dramatically. I can't disclose the name of this person, although this is a public record and it's not anything that came to us privately. Anyone has access to this. But I will tell you this, since 2/3 of their emissions are presently fugitive emissions in scope 1, and since scope 1 is larger than their stationary mobile combustion heat source, from other sources that heat the property and also relate to transportation, it's that big. They're only reporting about 10 or 15% of overall emissions from fugitive emissions. Okay, so if their number for fugitive emissions in this example is only 10 or 15%, represented to 10 or 15%, we were to multiply this by a factor of potentially 7, it would mean that stationary and mobile sources, traditional heat and the fleet of vehicles that they need to support their infrastructure, would only be 10% or so of their total scope 1 emissions. The other 90% could possibly be fugitive emissions. So that means refrigerant emissions can be upwards of 8-9 times greater than the emissions from stationary sources. That's a really powerful number. Chase, you have any comments, Roya?
No, I think there was a good study done in the UK that the CO2 emissions from the electricity that HVAC and refrigeration consumes, along with the fugitive refrigerant emissions, is estimated at 10% of the total CO2 emissions in the globe, right? Which is 3 times the amount that is done by shipping and transport. So it puts in perspective not only how much of an energy hog these devices are, but the effect that fugitive emissions has from a carbon reporting point of view.
Yeah, and it's very important to note that we've done a lot of research on this over the last few months. And back in 2014, Deloitte, we need any reference to who Deloitte is, happy to explain that. But Deloitte struggled with refrigerant emissions tracking, and their struggle led them to report a 3% emissions rate. And what they said is they struggled with collecting operational information because they had to make too many assumptions because they did not document, their client did not document their supply chain activity very well. And so after reviewing several years of data at the time, Deloitte chose to remove several sources of emissions from the global footprint for the companies they were auditing. And they decided to eliminate tracking of refrigerant from things like district cooling or cooling at all from the aggregate network level. They suggested that these emissions might only account for less than 3% of the audited emissions. However, it is most likely that this number came from a US greenhouse gas inventory country number for the United States, which we as a country report our emissions. And that number only accounts for HFC production plants based in the US and only from losses in production. So the Deloitte process struggle further exemplifies and acknowledges that the sources required to disclose this information are very hard to come by, but they also had provided an incredible underestimation of the total impact. And there should be no expectation by anybody that company reporting align with either the US greenhouse gas number or EPA regulatory reporting numbers. All right, the EPA reporting numbers are only meant for 50 pound and over refrigeration systems or 50 pound and larger comfort cooling that are HCFC. We hope to see HFCs return to the emissions tracking, but presently those are not included. So the expectation here is that the reporting will cover all emissions. Now, if you don't have an emissions number and you had the time, the EPA has hosted several events and they've talked about what emission factors you might use. So for instance, in medium and large commercial units of 50 to 2,000 pounds in refrigeration, they're saying assume a leak rate of 35% per year. At install, they're suggesting assume a 3% leak rate. At the end of life, they're saying assume a 70% leak rate. These numbers are larger for some classes of equipment, and they don't really line up to the real world numbers that we're seeing, but it should put in perspective for you how large this leak rate is in the United States when reporting fugitive emissions. And to any contractor or service provider who's on the call, the responsibility is shifting to not just report what the EPA is expecting, but report all refrigerant consumption on site. There is no exclusion for size of equipment. All right, Gavin, I see another question in there. Is there anything I need to address?
That was just my source of that Birmingham, the University of Birmingham in England, that 10% number.
Perfect, thank you. I can't see them on my screen for some reason. All right, look, just to iterate this again, company reporting is not intended. Company reporting for the SEC disclosure for ESGs is not intended to align with either the EPA compliance requirements, since those really only cover 50 pound and over assets, nor are they expected to align with the US greenhouse gas inventory, which only targets leaks from chemical plants that produce HFCs. So companies are expected to follow a performance value, which means you calculate all emissions, and after the first year, the SEC does not want you to estimate any longer. They expect some amount of estimating, and then that goes away. Then it's actual factual numbers. Treat refrigerant emissions exactly the way you treat financial disclosures. That's the expectation. And it's doable. Does anyone have any questions? All right, good. Now, sources of fugitive emissions. These are examples that might be forgotten. These are not all examples. Transport refrigeration. This is trucks, trailers, cargo containers that are refrigerated. Those often get overlooked. They often don't get accounted for. That's expected to be reported. Mobile AC units, cars and fleets, universities, campuses who have large fleets of vehicles, cities, towns, municipalities. They're great at counting buildings, not so great at counting mobile AC consumption. AC units, often left off the radar. We review hundreds and maybe millions of lines of code or records every year for assets. And oftentimes it's all refrigeration or all systems over 50 pounds. They're missing 80 to 90%. That missing 80 to 90% has to show up on the bottom line at some point in the next 3 years. Data center cooling units. I've heard data center people tell me, we don't need to report, we have special exemptions. Same thing goes for hospitals. I've had many hospitals tell me, I don't have to report that leaky AC unit that keeps the cadavers cold or the MRI unit cold. That's not part of the EPA's requirement. Well, first of all, that's a questionable statement. I've heard it hundreds of times. And secondly, it's not true here for the SEC. The SEC is expecting that these will be disclosed. Keep in mind the under 50-pound systems. Most people's over 50-pound systems only represent about 3 to 10% of their overall inventory. So if you're only counting those over 50-pounders, you might be leaving anywhere from 90 to 97% of your systems off your reporting ledger. Fire extinguishers count. They contain HFC refrigerants, FM200, common example. If you use a fire extinguisher or if you send a fire extinguisher off site, keep track of it. Hermetic units that are small and self-contained. I hear it all the time. I don't have to count them. Yes, you do. They're expected to be counted. If you want to make an assumption number because they're smaller, you can do that, but it can't really account for much more than 1% or 2% of your overall consumption if that's what you're doing. And lastly, CO2-based cooling units. If you're using CO2 to cool, even though it's a much lower GWP, 1, compared to refrigerants, thousands, you still have to report your CO2 impact from those leaks. All right, no questions. I'm going to keep going. Materiality. You're going to hear this come up a lot. For those of you who are used to working in mechanical rooms, you've never heard this before, trust me, it will become a topic over the next 2 to 3 years. Materiality statement. This is a common one. Warmer climates lead to cooling, an increase in cooling demand, which leads to higher maintenance. That's a material issue. If you turn these AC units on in April now, instead of May, that's a whole extra month. You have to add more maintenance to it. For instance, water towers, where you may have a water tower that you didn't have to turn on until May, and now you're turning it on in April, you're going to have extra maintenance for that water tower, extra chemicals, things like that. Keep that in mind. That's a material issue. Also, more cooling demand leads to higher energy costs. Another material issue, the AIM Act impacting access to future supply of obsolete refrigerants. These are all material issues. Double materiality. You may start to hear about this. It's a common term in Europe. It's becoming more common here. Your aging fleet of equipment is leaking, which is contributing to higher global warming emissions. You aren't just experiencing the problem through your materiality issue. You are contributing to it. Expect to have to explain that. Now, if you're thinking, okay, we're going to start submitting records to the SEC, they're not going to be able to get to all of this. Well, they don't have to, because they've got an army of your peers out there who are going to read these. Benchmarking against industry peers is an age-old practice of establishing whether or not everybody's working from the same level playing field. You have to ask yourself, are your peers only reporting HFCs and not ODS material? Are businesses in your industry only reporting emissions from AC units, or maybe they're skipping them, or under 50-pound units? You have to ask yourself other questions like, are you reporting assets? What % of your assets are you reporting leaks against? We have a lot of clients. It's very common. We see it at the beginning of a company's tenure with trackref. We'll see numbers in the 85% range, meaning they miss 85% of the equipment that they own for reporting. They're not required to because it's under 50 pounds. But that's not the case with the SEC. Check to make sure your leak rate's on par with the rest of the industry. We're hoping that industry groups will put together internal evaluations to determine whether or not companies are at, above, or below their peers in leaks. And, you know, how much you're reporting is based on estimates versus actual results. That's a very important question for the future. All right. Now, our view on this is after reviewing about 140 calendar year 2020 ESG reports, refrigerant emissions are underestimated. Our range is between 5 and 17%. We did see some outliers at 5 and 17x, sorry, not percent. So we're seeing people underestimate emissions significantly. The lowest ones were 5. The highest one we had was 20, or that I evaluated was 20. And 5 to 17, though, is very common. Most companies are reporting less than 10% of their refrigerant-related emissions. More than half of the companies that we talked to indicated that data availability and data quality remain their greatest challenge. With respect to, in our case, it was environmental, but I wrote ESG data. Less than 10% of the people that we talked to had an ESG council or working group. The number is actually much less than 10. And a strong majority of the people that we spoke to believe that they'll need additional resources to get the disclosures to meet the informational needs of critical stakeholders. All right. This quote is from Bricker. You know, this guy, Wes Bricker. Many companies have been reporting climate-related information. No consistency. He's no longer at the SEC. He's now at PwC. But I found this to be a great quote. This was the day after the SEC's discussion on the new ruling. And here at trackref, we've always taken the global warming potential of refrigerants seriously. We don't just actively sell software and participate in policy development, but we're also advocates. And so we're out there all the time driving the discussion on reducing leak rates. And what we advocate for, what our process is all about, is a hybrid process that connects to your CMMS so that you can operationalize sustainability collection. There are 45,000 trackref data collectors out there in the field every day collecting information on behalf of system owners. We believe that software to deploy governance and guide your workforce is the most efficient way to scale a solution. We have always applied the IPCC's AR4 guidance in reporting emissions. So it's baked into our solution. And for decades, we've participated in the ISO process to meet reporting and quality needs. And those ISO standards from 14,064, 14,001, those are embedded in trackref. Now, we use financial and accounting models to architect a process. So we just basically follow accounting principles when we're building out the architecture for how we collect data. And the backbone of this process is built on blockchain, because paramount to us is data integrity, and capturing accurate information is what drives every decision. And built into trackref are, for instance, the climate action reserves process for cylinder tracking, as well as I mentioned the IPCC and ISO protocols, as well as framework best practices that we adopt from either GRI or one of the other rapidly evolving processes that are quickly changing through consolidation. All right. Chase, Roya, Gavin, anybody, any questions? How'd I do? I made it.
I think a lot of people, right, they doubt until things are put into law. You know, what is the consensus in the marketplace? Like it's in the feedback stage, right, which is a 60-day stage where everyone can provide feedback and questions. You know, I've been reading a lot, like what do we think is actually going to move forward by the end of the year?
The rules are going to move forward exactly the way they are by the end of the year. And the reason we're incredibly confident in saying that is that the SEC has been going through this comment period for a year now. They opened it up nearly a year ago. And as I said, they've received 5,000 comments and read through, I believe, all of them. Any comments that come in now will largely be tied to the timing here, but they won't be adjustments to what's being disclosed. For instance, the SEC isn't going to change the statement around scope 1, 2, or 3. The SEC is not going to change their governance control. The SEC is not mandating that a company have a low emission rate or have requirements to meet certain expectations, except for the expectations that the company or the registrant makes for themselves. If you say you're on the road to net zero and you never get there, then that is the same thing as lying on your financial statement. So the changes that we might see might be tweaks to things like attestation or adjustments when we bring in scope 3, but they're not going to be changes to the actual requirements.
And then I guess, you know, politically speaking, let's say we have a more conservative, less environmental driven White House in 4 years or 8 years or whatever the case would be, 6 years or 10 years, I guess is the right time period. How likely is it the SEC just removes this from the books?
Well, it's a great question because this issue came up under a Republican-led SEC. So this has been evolving, and I tried to make that point throughout this discussion. This has been evolving through Republican and Democratic administrations. Shareholder information is held as a really serious responsibility, or making sure shareholder information is accurate is held as a serious responsibility by the SEC. And that's really what they're here to protect, is to do away with greenwashing, to do away with false information, and to do away with inconsistencies when shareholders and investors who are leading this charge are reviewing documentation. This isn't some visionary project of the SEC. The SEC was solicited by 140 companies to start this process years ago. All right. It took a little bit longer than I wanted, but I hope I got to everybody's questions. I hope it makes sense. If I have no other questions, I'm just going to thank everybody and make sure you know that we'll share everything with you, and we really appreciate your time. But final note, this has nothing to do with the EPA. The EPA did not invent scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions. They didn't invent the process. They didn't invent control or come up with the idea. This was developed in the private sector through WRI and was it IFRS, another group to come up with a greenhouse gas accounting process. You can't call the EPA and get them to change anything. This is driven by shareholders who want to see information displayed and presented accurately. It's critical to know that the SEC has been going through this process for a long time, and that there is very little that's going to change regardless of which administration is there. This is not a passion project of some appointee. This is a project that was built and developed because shareholders and investors are asking for it. If you have any questions, I encourage you to call us. Happy to answer them. We've been pouring through these records. We also have partners that we work with who are doing advising and consulting, and they have the exact same sentiment and takeaway that we do. Happy to hear anybody's comments afterwards if you want to share them. I really appreciate your time. Have a great day.